Okay, good afternoon. Let's start our afternoon session. So the first speaker will be Philippe Michel from Lausanne. He will talk about an invitation to applied electric cohomology.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. And I want to report some joint works that have been done over many years with Etienne Fouvry, who was my PhD advisor, and Emmanuel Kowalski. And we were also joined a bit later by Will Sawin. And I wanted to discuss about applied L-adic cohomology. So applied L-adic cohomology is a bit a provocative term that we invented, said to describe all the kind of recipe that you can use and develop to be able to use the powerful work of the powerful result in L-adic cohomology, and in particular the work of Deligne, but also of Grothendieck, Deligne, and of course subsequently also Katz and Lomont. And we want to apply, use this method in analytic number theory. And if you are an analytic number theorist and after a lot of pain, you face a very big and complicated algebraic exponential sum, usually you had two solutions. So either you try to apply Adolphson and Sperber, which does not always work, or you write an email to Nick Katz, and usually if he is interested in your problem, it's it will be very successful, and usually Nick Katz will write a book out of your problem. And it's very useful also for everybody. But we wanted to kind of offer a third option. And so then we tried to learn a bit and read a lot of the book of Katz to take out of it some general principle and to have a new ones that we hope would be easy to use by the everyday analytic number theorist. And later, so we were joined by Will Sawin, which added a lot of very powerful content to our investigation. So I want just to quickly remind you why we are interested, why we face algebraic exponential sum. This is because in analytic number theory, we are interested in congruences. So this is, of course, Gauss, who formalized the notion of congruence. And the main question we have in analytic number theory is you have a set, and you would like to understand the intersection of that set with given arithmetic progression, and we call Q the modulus. And so we want to understand the number of terms in this set which also belong to the arithmetic progression. And also, more generally, you give yourself a natural arithmetic function over the integer, and you would like to understand the distribution of this arithmetic function within an arithmetic progression. Typically, the arithmetic function could be the characteristic function of the set, but it could be something more general. So when you do this, usually you can use the Chinese remainder theorem, and you can reduce often the situation to when Q is a prime power or even a prime. And the prime case is usually the hardest situation. So, and I will focus on the prime case because I want to do some algebraic geometry. Okay, so the very first example, when you look for an arithmetic progression, it's really Dirichlet theorem, saying that there exists in any prime arithmetic, coprime arithmetic progression, you have infinitely many primes, and it was kind of a qualitative statement, but it could be made quantitative, and on that occasion, Dirichlet introduced a class of function of modulus Q, which are the Dirichlet characters, so the morphism of the multiplicative group modulo Q into the multiplicative group of the complex numbers. So, and this comes from him, and the reason for introducing this is because by Fourier theory, you can decompose the Dirac function at a given arithmetic progression into Dirichlet character, and out of this you can, with the invention also of the study of the so-called Dirichlet series, prove Dirichlet theorem. And you have a more precise version, which is due, I think, to Landau and come after the work of Adamard de Laval-Péssin, who really you have an asymptotic for the prime counting function for primes in arithmetic progressions. Okay. So another, so we have seen Dirichlet character, and another place where you can cross algebraic exponential sum in analytic number theory is when you want to study Diophantine equation, and this is even more general. You don't need to do analytic number theory for this, but so if you want to study the integral solution of a system of polynomial equations, then the congruence give you infinite set of necessary conditions for the existence of solutions. So, namely, each solution gives you a solution modulo Q for every Q. And one of the important aspects is whether this necessary condition is sufficient. And so, if it is sufficient, one says that you have a form of the local global principle or the Hasse principle. And if you do analytic number theory, you can study this Hasse principle by using the circle method of first invented by R.D. Littlewood. And then if you run the circle method and if you look at the contribution of the major arcs, you often fall on function, arithmetic function of on the ring modulo Q, which are quite a bit more complicated. So they are either into the form of a kind of a Fourier transform over the set of value of a polynomial, or this looks like, again, it's, you see, a form of a Fourier transform along the zero locus of a polynomial modulo Q. So these are the kind of sum that come up naturally, and here you have an additive character, which is coming from really the circle method, which is based on additive characters. So, and an example that of this study is to be found in the work of Klosterman. And so, in his lecture Monday, Shipping also reminded you this this situation where you try to generalize the four-square theorem and to study the representation of an integer n by this diagonal quadratic form, but with general, more general coefficients. So Klosterman studied this, and then he proved, at least when n is very large, that you have this local global principle. And for this, he introduced a form of the circle method, not exactly the orthodox one, but a variant. And during this variant, you had this other kind of exponential sum that appear, which are Klosterman sum. So you had a full lecture by Shipping about Klosterman sum. And you will have a new lecture right after me by Ravier. So really, this is to say how important they are. And what Klosterman showed is that these Klosterman sums, they admit a trivial bound, which with my normalization is q, they are bounded trivially by q to the 1/2. But what Klosterman showed is that if you could improve this trivial bound a little bit, then you would obtain an asymptotic formula for this number of representation of M by this quaternary quadratic form. And the most difficult case is when Q is a prime. And for this, Klosterman provided a non-trivial bound. So the bound he got was twice 1/4 of Q, which improved Q to the 1/2 quite a bit. And he did this by computing the fourth moment of Klosterman sums. Okay. So in any case, what one wants to do, one wants to understand either the set of solutions of a system of polynomial equation, modulo Q, or we want to understand the size of certain exponential sum that occur when you face a problem in analytic number theory. So this is very common. And when Q is prime, so the ring modulo Q is a field, and then you can do algebraic geometry. So the first result of that, there was a result first due to Hasse for elliptic curves, but the first general result in that direction is due to André Weil in the 40s, and Weil essentially solved the problem of either counting the number of solutions to a polynomial equation, or to bound exponential sum in the case of dimension 1. So this is a resolution of the so-called Riemann hypothesis for algebraic curve over finite fields. And in particular, if we return to Klosterman sum, so Weil improved the Klosterman bound from 2 to the q to the 1/4 to 2. So, and in fact, this bound is absolutely sharp, but you have to wait a little bit to know that this is how sharp it is, and, or if you have to remember shipping lecture. And in the case of higher dimension, Weil formulated a series of conjectures called the Weil conjecture, which he proposed that this problem should admit a cohomological interpretation. And these conjectures were taken over by Grothendieck in the 50s, who developed the formalism of étale and L-adic cohomology, and he developed it with many of his students, including Deligne, Illuzy, Katz, Verdier, many other people at IHES. And but there is also the work of Dwork in the US, for instance. And then in the 70s, so Pierre Deligne solved the Weil conjecture, established the Weil conjecture, and it's very interesting, and we are very proud of this, but Deligne's argument use some principle from analytic number theory, so the Rankine trick, and later he used the so-called Rankine-Selberg method. So, and with subsequently, Weil, Deligne gave much more sophisticated treatment, which is called Weil 2. And this leads us to this notion of trace function, which are the main object I want to discuss. So, what are trace functions? So, these are, at least in dimension 1, which kind of is a bit of a main case, at least for the basic theorem, they admit relatively concrete interpretation in terms of Galois representation. So, and the main concept is that of an L-adic sheaf, which in dimension 1 or over the affine line, say, is simply, in my case, a Galois representation of the group of rational fraction over of the field of rational fraction over FQ. So this is a Galois representation, which is takes value in the linear group of L-adic finite dimensional L-adic vector space, and this representation is unramified outside a set of dimension 0, which concretely is outside the set of roots of a single polynomial. Okay. So this is the data is such a representation in very elementary terms, and whenever you have a close point at unramified place, you get a number by taking the trace of the Frobenius at that point, at that place, acting on your vector space. So then, a priori, you get a number which is a L-adic number, but you can see it as a complex number just by embedding the L-adic numbers into the field of complex numbers. And okay, so your function a priori it's defined only where the representation is unramified, but you can extend it, either you extend it by 0, or you extend it by taking the trace of Frobenius, but on the inertia invariant at the given plate. So for us, this extension will not matter much, but okay, the second one is better maybe than the extension by 0. Anyway, so it's not very too important for us. Okay, so this is what I said, but you can get complex numbers. And then if you take just the close point, unramified close point of degree 1, then this is the complement of the set of roots of a polynomial in FQ, and you can see it as a function on FQ, then on Z mod QZ, and then you can view this function on Z mod QZ as a Q periodic function on Z. So, and this function that you get this way is a so-called trace function associated to the sheaf F or to the representation that this sheaf is. Any question? Any question? No? Okay. Okay. So these trace function or the sheaf, they admit important invariant. Maybe the most important one is the so-called geometric sheaf. This is, in our terminology, this is just the restriction of the representation to the geometric Galois group, which is just when your constant function, you take them to be the constant, but over an algebraic closure of FQ. So then this is a representation of a subgroup, so of a smaller group, and this is called the geometric sheaf associated to this situation. This one is the one, this representation is the one which drives the thing and of which properties that we want to extract will be coming from. Also, this representation, it admits a measure of complexity, which part of it could be called the Artin conductor, but you also need to include the dimension of the representation. And so we call this complexity. So it measures how much the representation is ramified plus its dimension. And okay, and in analytic number theory, you will always have a trace function whose so you have a trace function modulo Q, but the Q will go to infinity, but the complexity of the trace function will remain bounded. So you should think what we call the trace function. It's a bit of an abuse. It's for every Q, you get a trace function, okay, which varies with Q in a natural way, but all the complexity of the representations mod Q are bounded independently of Q. So that's the regime we work in. There could be other regimes, interesting regimes when the complexity grows with Q, but and it's tied with kind of the talk by Mark Schusterman. Okay, so an important aspect, if we speak about number, is that of purity. So we say that the sheaf is pure of weight 0 if at every point where the representation is ramified, the eigenvalue of the Frobenius, when we now see them as complex numbers embedded from an embedding of the L-adic into the complex, if all these eigenvalues are of modulus 1. So I take this normalization. And in that case, you see that the absolute value of the trace function is bounded by the dimension of the representation, which itself is bounded by what we call the complexity of the sheaf. Okay, so you can imagine a family of function modulo Q which are absolutely bounded as Q varies. Okay, and okay, you could have trace function of weight 1, weight 2, anything, but you can always normalize things by dividing by power of square root of Q. So we will reduce to weight 0 just to think of a trace function as something bounded. And if the trace function is pure of weight 0, then you can decompose kind of the trace function, or kind of you have to do some trickery, semi-simplification, and so on. But you can decompose the trace function into a sum of geometrically isotypic trace functions, so for which the geometric representation is almost irreducible. And for us, most cases we will see are just irreducible trace functions, so geometrically irreducible representations. Okay, but what is to say is that you can reduce to the case of something coming from an irreducible representation pretty easily. Or, okay, it's not easy because it's the lean veil too, but you can do it. And so another very important invariant, and it will be invariant important for us, of a sheaf or of a trace function, these are the so-called geometric and arithmetic monodromy group. So what are they? The arithmetic monodromy group, you take the image of your big Galois representation and you take the Zariski closure into the linear group, and you get an algebraic group, and of course, and the geometric monodromy group, it's the Zariski closure of the image of the geometric representation. And really the important one is the geometric monodromy group. And this geometric monodromy group is a reductive group. It's a bit what I discussed before when one does a decomposition into isotypic. But it's the computation of this group is not at all obvious. It requires you to know a bit, a lot of information on the representation, the local monodromy at the various ramification points. And but Katz, fortunately, computed the monodromy group of many natural trace functions, and many trace functions that occur, I would say, in analytic number theory. So this is very helpful. Yeah. And on the top of this, he wrote a very extensive book that you can read, and which are just very complete, very well written. And these books are really like yeah, Bible, because this is the way that I think analytic number theories should make their should learn a bit of this theory, because it has a lot of examples. It's very concrete, very complete also. Okay, so some example. If you take the constant function 1, then it corresponds to the trivial representation. If you take a Dirichlet character is also a trace function, and the sheaf is called the Kummer sheaf, and it is ramified only at 0 and infinity on the projective line. So then its conductor is 3, because it's of dimension 1, and then it is tamely ramified at 0 and infinity, so you get 3 in total, and the monodromy group is just the roots of unity of the order of the character. And for additive character, it's also an n-adic sheaf called the Artin-Schreier sheaf, which has also conductor 1, but for different reasons. So it's only ramified at infinity, but it has wild ramification. And the sheaf that creates the Klosterman sums, so it's called the Klosterman sheaf. This one is two-dimensional. It's unramified on outside 0 and infinity, and the conductor is 5. And its geometric monodromy group is SL2, so it has determinant 1. And okay, the arithmetic monodromy group is also SL2. Yeah, these are some examples. How am I? Oh, yeah, not too bad. Cool. Okay, and also, whenever you have some trace function, you can create new ones relatively easily. So the complex conjugate of a trace function is a trace function associated to the contra-gradient representation. The sum of a trace function is associated to the sum of the representation. The product of trace function, it's a tensor product. It's coming from the tensor product. One which is also very interesting is that if you take a trace function and you precompose it by a non-constant rational fraction over HQ, then it's also a trace function associated to a so-called pullback sheaf, which is simply the given representation, but restricted to a subgroup of the Galois group of finite index, the Galois group associated with the covering given by F. So it's all this is very elementary. And whenever you do these operations, the complexity of the sheaf are well controlled in terms of the complexity of the initial data. So if you remember the regime of having bounded complexity when Q goes to infinity. Okay, but something which is much less trivial, and it's due to Lomont, is that if you take a trace function, and you assume that this trace function is not an additive character, which you say by saying that the sheaf is not isomorphic geometrically to an Artin-Schreier sheaf, or the sheaf of an additive character, then the naive Fourier transform conveniently normalized, so just defined that way, is also a trace function. And the underlying sheaf is called the geometric Fourier transform of F. And so this is really a deep theorem of Lomont. And in fact, Lomont has also proven that the very existence of this Fourier transform operation is sufficient to prove the main result from the ligne Weil 2. So it's really a deep result, a deep concept. And also what you have is that if you look at the complexity of the Fourier transform, then its complexity is bounded in terms of the complexity of the initial sheaf, and the bound is at most polynomial. So, okay. So Fourier transform, it's very good because we do Fourier transform every time we do Poisson in analytic number theory. And also we take a Dirichlet multiplicative convolution, and this operation also exists at the level of trace function. So if you take two trace function, okay, you avoid some things where it can degenerate, so which are not associated to multiplicative character, then their multiplicative convolution, which is defined in the really natural way, is also, more or less or essentially a trace function. And its complexity, again, it's controlled by the initial complexity. And again, this is not really an obvious result. And for this, to prove either Lomond theorem or Lehman theorem of this theorem of Katz, then you need to have the full the notion of L-adic cohomology, but over higher dimensional objects. So in fact, in dimension 2, in both of these cases. So you need you cannot just rest with Galois representation. We need to really up your game a bit to understand these theorems. But you can use them at least. And an example of objects which are constructed out of multiplicative convolution. These are the so-called hyperclusterman sums. So the Clusterman sums are really constructed as the multiplicative convolution of two copies of the same additive characters. And if you iterate this construction, you get the so-called hyperclusterman sums. And these are trace functions. And the complexity of the hyperclusterman sheaf of when you do k iteration of the multiplicative convolution is k plus 3. And the geometric monodromy group of these sheaves, it's either SLK or SPK, depending on the parity of k. So I let you decide which is which. And you have other interesting examples in analytic number theory, which are so-called hypergeometric sums. So, for which geometry, but Katz computed many of these geometric monodromy group, and it's in exponential sum in and differential equation. So, yeah. Okay. Okay, so, and the main, one of the key players for us is the so-called Grothendieck-Lefschetz trace formula, which tell you, which gives a cohomological interpretation of the sum of a trace function over all the unramified points over FQ. And this sum is an alternating sum of traces of Frobenius, of the absolute Frobenius, of the geometric Frobenius over FQ, and which is acting on some vector spaces which are called compactly supported L-adic cohomology group of the underlying sheaf. But it's a sum of at most 3 terms and at most 3 traces of an endomorphism. And in our situation, so the zero cohomology group is always 0, so very good. The top cohomology group, it has an interpretation as the space of geometric co-invariant of the sheaf. So maybe of the dual. And so you have this interpretation, and in particular, if your sheaf is geometrically isomorphic, this H2 is also 0. And for the H1, the dimension of the H1, and so the dimension of H2 is bounded by the dimension of the sheaf, so by the complexity, and the dimension of H1 is also controlled by the complexity of the sheaf. So everything is under control in terms of dimensions, and then you have the very important result of the linear veil 2, which bounds the eigenvalue on the middle cohomology group. So if my initial sheaf is of weight 0, then the eigenvalues of Frobenius acting on this H1 are bounded by square root of Q. So in particular, if your sheaf is geometrically irreducible and non-trivial, then the average value of your trace function is decaying relatively fast at speed 1 over square root of q, and this is what is called square root cancellation. So because the trivial bound of this average should be the complexity of the sheaf, and here you go below the complexity and q minus 1/2, and the constant depends on the complexity. In fact, yeah. So, okay, and here is maybe, it's a consequence of the Lin-Mein theorem, but it's important for us, is that trace functions exhibit a kind of approximate orthogonality, have an approximate orthogonality property. So if you take two geometrically irreducible sheaves and you compute the average value of, so the correlation between these two trace functions, then this correlation will be equal to, let's say, 1 times a complex number. Okay, this correlation will have a main term and an error term with square root cancellation, and the main term of maybe 0. It is 0 if the sheaves are not geometrically isomorphic, and it will be of modulus 1 over y. So you can detect, and again the constant involved here depend only on the complexity of the sheaves. So you have a way to detect kind of analytically whether two sheaves are geometrically isomorphic or not, as long as you have a bound on their complexity. Just compute the correlation sum, and if you can evaluate it, so you can work with this formula in both directions, either to get bounds on some that because you know that the sheaves are isomorphic or not, or if you don't know this, but you are able to evaluate the correlation sum, you will know the property of this sheaf. So, and this is analogous, of course, to the orthogonality property for Dirichlet characters. Okay, so what do we want to do when we do applied dyadic homology? We have a trace function, which we view as a q-periodic function over the integers, and we give ourselves another arithmetic function, and then we want to evaluate, we need to evaluate the correlation between the trace function and our natural arithmetic function, and we take the partial sum of length some parameter x, and okay, what do we want to do? We want kind of to know whether we can do better than what would be the trivial bound for this correlation sum obtained just by putting absolute values everywhere. And okay, so we want to try to say more than just the trivial bound. So that's really a recurrent objective. And what we want to do is to develop methods to achieve this objective. So take the most basic example, but still very important, is when the arithmetic function is a characteristic function of an interval of length x. And okay, you can split your interval into sub-intervals of length q, and then you can apply the Grothendieck-Lefschetz and the Lin theorem. So we can assume that x is smaller than q. And then how do you analyze this? You do Fourier theory. So you apply a Plancherel formula to this sum. So it's the sum of the trace function and the characteristic function of the interval, and you do Plancherel. So it will become the sum of the product of the Fourier transforms, and then you bound the Fourier transform. And so the Fourier transform of the characteristic function of an interval is bounded, its L1 norm is bounded by square root of q, essentially. So then you get that this sum is bounded by square root of q times the subnorm of the Fourier transform of your trace function. But by the work of Lomont, you know that the subnorm of the Fourier transform is a trace function, and so it's bounded only in terms of the initial complexity. Okay, so then you, in the end, you get the so-called Polya-Vinogradov bound. So if your trace function is not an additive character, for which you can really be a bit wild, okay, so then it becomes Diophantine approximation problem. But if it is not an additive character, then your partial sum of trace function is bounded by essentially square root of q. So, in particular, whenever the length of your interval is a bit bigger than square root of q, you get a non-trivial bound for this sum, and so it will say that your trace function exhibits cancellation within this interval. So this is not something really obvious, because the characteristic function of an interval does not have a real meaning in algebraic geometry. But so you mix some argument from real and I would say geometric Fourier analysis to deduce this property. And so this square root of q is called the Polya-Vinogradov range. And improving this range, this square root of q, so you have something non-trivial whenever x is a bit bigger than square root of q. Can you do something non-trivial when x is smaller than square root of q? This is a very, very deep problem in analytic number theory, which would have many important consequences. And it is known in some cases, but it's very limited. So you have the case of trace function, which are so-called polynomial phases. So an additive character evaluated at the polynomial values. It's due to Hermann-Weyl. Or you have the case of Dirichlet character and the famous Burgess bound. And then you have product of these two. And you have also Fourier transform of products of these two, which work. So, but it's very limited compared to what we would like to have. So, for instance, we would like to have something with beyond Burgess, beyond Polya-Vinogradov for EQ of 1 over x. So that would be quite a splash. Okay. And also, so if you are interested in short sum, you have the question also of kind of in probability theory of studying the distribution of these partial sum when x range from 1 to q. And then you can get very funny pictures, so which are example of the path that a trace function take when you sum it. So for this is a kind of Klosterman path, and this is Birch walk, and these pictures are by Emmanuel and Will, and they studied kind of this pattern in a probabilistic way. So now maybe my main point, I would like just to highlight what is happening. So we would like to get Burgess bound for as many trace functions as possible, and we cannot quite do this, but if we are willing to relax the situation, then we can do something. So instead of looking just as a partial sum along an interval of a trace function, then we may consider bilinear sums. So Shipping explained you how useful this is to be able to bound these bilinear sums of trace function. In his case, it was bilinear sum of Klosterman sums to bound them non-trivially, and this has important implication in analytic number theory. So if you look at this problem, then you can see that now you have two variables, so you have an extra average which gives you more room to play. And if one of these two variables is bigger than square root of q, then you could apply the Polya-Vinogradov method, okay, and get a non-trivial bound. And this is not completely trivial, so this is one of the first things we did in some generality. But really, many applications, you would like to go below the Burgess bound, so below for m and n, both smaller than square root of q. So here is so here are some applications of going below square root of q. So you have this result about distribution of arithmetic function, and especially primes in very long arithmetic progressions. So these you have some aspect of applied L-adic homology, which is occurring in Yetang Zhang's proof on bounded gaps between primes. And you have some complicated algebraic exponential sum to bound, which can be treated as bilinear sum of trace functions. So the players are bilinear sum in the ternary hyperclusterman sums. So KL free with KLK with K is equal to 3. And also, if you study moments of L functions, so analytical function and their moment, then there are some applications to bilinear sums of Clusterman or hyperclusterman sums to study this problem. So we'll not go too much into describing these applications, but I will give a kind of general theorem, which is one of the first that we obtained, and it's quite general. So he said that if you have a trace function which is not an additive character, and you see and if the product of the two variables is bigger, a little bit bigger than q to the 3/4, then the bilinear sum that you can form when the two complex numbers alpha and beta are equal to 1 admits a non-trivial bound. Okay? So in particular, if you take your two smooth variables m and n to be equal, you obtain non-trivial bound when n is when n is a bit bigger than q to the 3/8, which is smaller than q to the 1/2. So we have beaten the Polya-Vinogradov bound in this situation. And you see this is extremely general because the only assumption is you don't want your trace function to be constant, to be an additive character. And so it's very easy to use. If you need it, you just take it and use it. So maybe something a bit more It's the proof is interesting because it goes through it goes through another problem of trace function, which is interaction of trace function with Ecker eigenvalues of modular form. So we have this the previous theorem is a consequence of this one, which is here, which is really correlation of a trace function and Ecker eigenvalue of a modular form when the length is a bit bigger than q to the 3/4, and this the previous result is obtained by specializing the modular form to be a packet of Eisenstein series. Okay, but I will not. I will not have time, but maybe I should say that the proof requires some classification in L-adic cohomology, which is to classify or to identify the so-called group of automorphism of L-adic sheaf. So it's not very complicated, but we have to show that a certain group is not very big, a certain subgroup of PGL2 the group of fractional linear transformation of the projective line is not very big. So this is the theoretical content of this theorem. Okay. And, but maybe I want to state a much more general result. Okay. So now I do not require my bilinear form to have a smooth coefficient, to have coefficient equal to 1. So, and then I have this sort of bilinear sum, which is in a general format. And it is, again, it admits a non-trivial bound whenever the product of the two variables is a bit bigger than q to the 3/4, and no variable is equal to 1. And the assumption is somewhat more restrictive. So, and the assumption are on the geometric monodromy group of the sheaf. So then we need to know things about it. So we will have this bilinear sum bound if the sheaf is the geometric monodromy group is as either a simple connected component which is simple and acts irreducibly on the representation, or if the geometric monodromy group is finite, then we have a kind of condition which is, for instance, if this finite geometric monodromy group admits a normal subgroup which is also simple, then we will have this bound. So, and for instance, the finite cases, it's interesting when you face hypergeometric trace functions. So, and of course, it's restrictive because you need to know a lot. You need to know these invariants, which are very important. But then you have the work of Katz to help you. So, for instance, as I said, in case of hypergeometric sum, the geometric monodromy group is SLK or SPK. So the conditions are met when soon as k is bigger than, strictly bigger than 1. And for you have also, you can meet some hypergeometric sum, and then you get, for good configuration, you get groups which satisfy what you want. Okay. And maybe for people who would be willing to use this, who have maybe a potential application for this bilinear sum bounds, maybe I should say that this condition of simplicity, it's quite robust. So you see, if you have a sheaf, a trace function which is good, in whose say connected component as of the geometric monodromy group is simpler, then if you take the trace function which you get by pullback, then it will be also good automatically. So that's very useful because you could have a hyperclusterman sum which come in life, but they could come with precomposed with something which is different from the identity map. And as soon as the map is not constant, this property will be satisfied. So again, it's very easy to use if you know some, yeah. And also another situation where it's useful is that suppose that you have a sheaf which is good and you are in a situation when all so that the arithmetic monodromy group is equal to the connected component of the monodromy group. So this is the case for Clusterman sum. Then you can post-compose your representation with any irreducible representation of the arithmetic monodromy group, and you can apply this the theorem again. So you can take, for instance, all the symmetric powers of, say, Clusterman sums, and if you have a use of it, we will speak of symmetric powers of Clusterman sums soon, so that will be useful. Okay, so maybe, okay, so there are more cases, and I had prepared a lot of stuff, but I think I should stop. Yeah. Okay, so in the rest of the slides, if you want to understand, have an idea of the proof, I have given an account, an explanation, and just what I want to emphasize about the proof is that it is very soft. You don't need to know the local monodromy of your sheaf. You just need to know its geometric monodromy group. So it's a very soft proof, which is based on general techniques from analytic number theory called the method of moments. So, and, but in this case, it was kind of due to Xu, and which we, so he did it in the case of sheaf of dimension 1, and we generalized to higher dimension. So method of moments, and then something called, something around Gursa lemma. So that's why you have this simplicity assumption and the geometric monodromy group, but some version which is robust. So somewhat a bit of group theory. And in the end, what is important for all these soft proof to work, and I would like to advertise it's something else to read, is a so-called quantitative sheaf theory by that was initiated by Will Sawin, and that was really written down and expanded by Arthur Forer, Javier Frezan, Emmanuel Kowalski, and Will Sawin. And what this quantitative sheaf theory says, roughly, is that whenever you have a finite number of reasonable operation on starting from an initial sheaf, if you do this operation, then the complexity of the object, how complicated it is, will always be controlled by the initial complexity of the sheaf, and in fact, the control will even be polynomial. So really the reason why we can have a proof which is soft compared to earlier proof that we have in special cases is because of the existence of this quantitative sheaf theory. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
So in this talk, we show that certain algebraic exponential sums are related to sheaves, and some analytic operations on the trace functions are related to operations on sheaves. I am interested in what kind of functions can arise as the trace function of a certain sheaf. So if we have a function here, what properties does it need to satisfy?
Okay, it's an inverse problem. So, okay, you would like, okay, so one thing is that you need to specify more because your trace function, okay, you can see it as a function over, say, the affine line, over FQ, but with a trace function, you have a full package of trace function for every finite extension of Q. And this package is also very important. The knowledge of all this family of trace function is very important. In fact, they play a role in, okay, okay. I forgot this. But we need, when we do this method of moments, for instance, we use the extension of the trace function to every finite extension and let the finite extension go to infinity because we want to get some geometric information over the algebraic closure. So to ask your question, how do I recognize a trace function? You have to take care of the data. For instance, if you take a random function over F23, you can form a sheaf which maps this trace function. So what you need to specify is maybe a bound on the complexity and something like this. So with Fouvry and Emmanuel, we have a paper where we count the number of trace function of geometrically reducible of a given complexity, and this used argument from the theory of codes of what's the name, Levenstein. So we use this bound on optimization to give a polynomial bound on the number of trace function modulo q of given complexity. Maybe this is q to the power, some power times the complexity. So the trace function have constraint, and you can, for instance, using approximate orthogonality, it's one constraint that you can, but you have to give sufficiently many data to ask this question of classification.
All right.
But okay, but at least if you start from a reasonable function, trace function, then you can construct it by product sum, Fourier transform, multiplicative convolution, additive convolution works also. It's more funky, but yeah.
All right. Thank you, sir.
More questions?
So there's a theory of L-adic shifts over the base ring FQ. I'm now curious about, are there an analog theory for if I replace FQ by Z mod a power of P?
Maybe Pierre can say something? No? Okay, so yeah, so I think when you go in, try to do into p-adic analysis, I don't think this exists, I don't know. You would, what do? You take the width ring, and if you want to do Z mod P, I don't know if something exists. Frankly, I really am not, I don't know. Maybe, or maybe someone, yeah, you often get away by doing a stationary phase and so on, but I don't know of something existing like this. It's still at the level of cooking and recipes. And, so to do p to the k with modular functions, yeah.
Okay.
So I don't know much more than don't know the basic principles of.
All right. Oh, never mind. Thank you.
Okay, you can continue discussion during the coffee break. So let's send speaker again.